Great. Well, hello, everyone. I think I'm going to kick us off now. So hello and very warm welcome from sunny Oxford here in the UK. Thanks very much for joining us for the fourth session of our Engaging with Evidence series. It's a true pleasure to have participants joining us today from across the world and across different sectors. My name is Tanya Hamid, and I'm a Research and Policy Associate here at the Government Outcomes Lab based at the University of Oxford. And I'm really excited to be here with you today and to be co-hosting this session with my colleague, Andrea. In today's session, we're excited to be sharing some of our own research from the Government Outcomes Lab around the use of outcome funds globally. And for those of you who might be joining us for the first time today, here's a bit more about who we are. So at the Government Outcomes Lab, we are a research centre based at the University of Oxford within the Blavatnik School of Government. And we were established in 2016 as a partnership between UK government and the University of Oxford. Our focus is very much on applied and engaged research around the government's role in unlocking fruitful cross-sector partnerships to improve social outcomes. This session is part of the wider Engaging with Evidence series. We launched the series back in January and designed it as an open platform for policymakers, practitioners, and researchers around the world to engage with key findings from the latest research and evaluation work in the field. So we often kick off with the distillation of key research findings, then expand through practical insights from practitioners across different sectors and fields, and all the while try and have a very honest and constructive dialogue. For our previous sessions, we've looked at impact bonds in Latin America, FCDO's pilot program for development impact bonds across Asia and Africa, and a pioneering project in India around maternal health. You can find the recordings and slides from these sessions on our website, along with other knowledge resources. We do have many more sessions planned, and we will be sharing details for these very soon. So please do sign up to our newsletter and do follow us on social media to stay updated on new sessions as well as other GoLab events. And coming back to today's session, we have three main parts to the discussion. So we'll be kicking off with an overview of the global landscape of outcomes funds. We will also be looking at a summary of key findings and recommendations from GoLab's research, including rationales for the research and practical recommendations for policymakers. And then finally, we'll be kicking off a panel discussion around three core themes. These are very much going to be the bulk of the session. So we'll be looking at rationales for outcomes funds, design choices, and also practical considerations for implementation. This will also be a great opportunity to hear from some practitioners who are working on a range of outcomes funds internationally, including places such as the UK, Colombia, India, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and who we are very lucky to have with us today. We usually have a very engaged and interactive discussion, so please do keep dropping any questions into the chat, and we will be picking this up throughout the session. Please also try and keep your cameras on if possible. It's always great to see people's faces, but please do keep yourselves on mute unless asked to contribute. We are recording this session and we will be uploading the recording onto our website shortly after we are done. Before we get started, we do want to get to know you a bit better. We have more than 100 participants online at the moment, and it would be great to know a bit more about the kind of perspectives they're bringing into this conversation. So I'm going to kick off a very quick Zoom poll that you will see on your screen now. And so it would be really great to see what sort of perspective you're bringing in, whether you're quite new to this space and quite new to outcomes funds and looking to understand how they work, or you're perhaps fairly knowledgeable and interested to understand a bit more about what the practice looks like globally and what the emerging evidence is, or you might already be quite deeply immersed in development and quite experienced and just looking to expand what the emerging evidence can tell us, or it might indeed be another perspective. So please do let us know. We'll give this another minute or so and then proceed with the session. I see some responses trickling in already. I'm not sure if all of you can see what the results look like, but what I can see is a lot of people seem to be fairly knowledgeable and interested to understand more about the practice globally and emerging evidence, so about 42% of the audience. Others are new to outcome funds and looking to understand how they work, so that's about 29% of our audience today, and others are more experienced and looking to just expand what they already know. Great. I'm just going to end the poll now and see if I can share the results with you. So there we go. Hopefully everyone can see that. So 41% fairly knowledgeable, others quite new to the space, and others deeply immersed. So I think it's a good sort of split across various some levels of experience and knowledge on this, and hopefully everyone will have something to take away from today's conversation, also a lot to contribute. Great, so I think with that, we can kick off the first part of our session. And so to kick us off, I will be handing things over first to Louise Savelle, who will be giving us an overview of the global landscape for outcomes funds. Louise is a co-founder and director at Social Finance. She's also visiting fellow of practice at the Blavatn School of Government. And then she will be handing over to Mara Noel, who will be taking us through the key findings of their work. Mara is a director for the Government Outcomes Lab, and Elle is our research director. Between them, they lead on many of the research projects here at the Go Lab. So over to you, Louise.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today, and a privilege to be a visiting fellow of practice at the Blavatn School of Government, in which role I've had the opportunity to work alongside a really experienced and inspiring team of academics to undertake the research that we'll be talking about today. As Tanya mentioned, in today's session, you'll hear from me, from Elle and Mara, but it really has been a team effort to get the research to this point. So a huge thanks also to Claire, Rory, Steph, and Juliana for their time, insight, and expertise. Tanya, can we have the next slide? So our research was prompted by two primary observations. Observation one was that outcome funds are being widely touted as the solution for taking either impact bonds or outcomes-based contracting to scale. However, observation two was that existing outcome funds vary quite widely in terms of both their objectives and their design. And we hypothesized that some of these design choices would radically affect the impact of the outcome funds themselves. It's still too early to say if that's true. And instead, our research aimed to characterize the different models of outcomes fund that we're seeing in the market. Now, before we talk a little bit about what we found, it's important to define what we mean by outcomes fund. It doesn't have a single definition. So I'm just going to introduce the way that we defined it for the purposes of our research. So we looked to find outcomes funds that had a dedicated pot of funding to pay for social outcomes. And that excluded funds that are in the very early stage of their development and have yet to raise the money. It also excluded funds that seek to invest to pre-finance service delivery against outcomes-based contracts, but which expect to be repaid. So this is dedicated funding to pay for outcomes. The second criterion we used was that we looked at funds that intended to support or issue multiple separate contracts. By separate, we mean that provider contracts would stand or fall on their own success. The third criterion we used was that outcomes funds would be open to the involvement of impact investment. Now, not all of the funds in our sample require impact investment to be applied, but all of them are open to or enabling in terms of their openness to impact investment involvement. And the final criterion we applied was that the funds had to be live. They had to either have been or be open for applications at November 2020. Now, before moving on, it's important to note that we are aware there are a range of other tools in the market that aim to drive the adoption of outcomes-based contracting, including incubation funds, development grants, feasibility support. But for the purposes of our research, we've really specifically narrowed in on funds that pay for outcomes. So moving on to the fund locations. In our sample, we identified 17 funds that met the definition that I discussed. The boundary is a little bit slippery. I think there's a question as to whether the outcome fund we identified in India really is an outcomes fund in the sense of each contract standing or falling on its own 2 feet, or whether actually it's a large impact bond. And I think there are other initiatives in the market that call themselves outcomes funds that we've chosen to exclude because they didn't meet one or more of the criterion we defined. So the map here shows the geographic location for outcomes payments. And it's worth noting that only the UK has launched more than 2 of these funds to date. So thinking about scale, outcomes funds are widely seen as a route to scale for outcomes contracts and impact bonds, but aspirations around scale vary depending on outcome funder motivation. So we saw funds in the market that define scale in terms of the total value of committed outcomes funding. We saw other funds that prioritized the value of individual contracts that were issued from those outcomes funds. Others that looked at the number of individual contracts, the number of contractual stakeholders in terms of either investors and or co-commissioners, and yet more that looked at numbers of service users. In terms of potential hypotheses, we could, it seems possible that those outcomes funds that are seeking to build the market for outcomes contracting or impact investing might tend to focus more on the number of contracts and contractual stakeholders, in contrast potentially to those that are seeking to primarily improve the efficiency of spending, which might prioritize bigger outcomes pots, bigger individual contracts, or larger numbers of individual service users. And when we then look at where the size of the funds in our sample, and what we've done on the next slide is to map the announced value of the outcomes funds converted into US dollars for ease of comparison. And it's important just to note that the announced value might sometimes be greater than the outcomes fund value that subsequently gets committed. In other cases, particularly funds that sought to act like top-up funds to other commissioners, like the UK Life Chances Fund, the committed outcomes funding that results may actually end up being considerably higher than that was announced. We're looking at roughly 10 years worth of outcomes funds in this list. So the fund that launched first was the UK Innovation Fund, and that was launched in around 2011, 2012. And I think it's important to note that there's no clear trend in terms of the size of the outcomes funds here over time. We see bigger and smaller funds being launched over the entirety of those 10 years. When we look at the funds that are in the bigger end of this, almost all of them are top-up funds. Almost all seek to draw other outcomes commissioners into the market and seek to top up other people's funding. When we look at the sort of mid-range, the 20 to 40, 20 to $50 million range, we see more funds that are specifically targeting a particular set of outcomes for a particular tightly defined population. But almost all these funds are over 5 million in scale, and the one that wasn't has an ambition to do that. It's just only raised and launched one funding or one contracting round to date. So finally, before I hand over to Elle, I'm going to just kind of touch on the focus of the outcomes funds in our sample. So perhaps unsurprisingly, almost all of the outcomes funds in our sample had an explicit commitment to Goal 17 in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. And Goal 17 is to strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. So that really speaks to the intent of outcomes funds to drive cross-sector partnerships for social impact. Similarly, most have a social equity focus of some kind, some explicitly around gender. Beyond that, in terms of sectors, the funds within our sample have tended to focus on employment, education, and health outcomes in that order. But I think it's important to note that at this stage of market development, that's really a descriptive analysis rather than necessarily one that is indicative of where outcomes fundings or the kind of social challenges that outcomes-based contracts could drive impact around in future. Now, I'm conscious that the chart on the right won't be easily legible from this slide, but what it illustrates, I think, is the link between individual outcomes funds and some of the SDGs. And you can really see from this how each fund is often targeting more than one of the SDGs. So at this point, we're going to open up for a poll. We'd like to hear from you as to why outcomes funds, what are the main reasons, the motivations for creating an outcomes fund? And if you're able to, we'd love you to tick up to 3 motivations, so we can get a sense of why you think they might be an interesting and important tool.
Great. Thank you, Louise. And while those responses to the poll come in, I'll just step in and talk about how we as a research team have been working to try and make the global landscape of outcome funds more legible by describing the ways in which outcome funds vary. That list of potential justifications for pursuing outcome funds already shows that they're quite a mixed bag, a curious set of policy tools that aim to support outcomes contracts. They're such a mixed bunch, though, in terms of what they actually look like. There's no single outcome fund tool or model. And so what we've been doing is trying to develop tools and frameworks to compare the different models or approaches that are adopted under this title or under the banner of outcome funds. And there are 2 main strands of our analysis. The first part has been to develop a prototype of publicly available outcome fund information. Oh, and our results have just come in, curiously. Louise, do you want to speak to these results?
I can do. So I think we can see from this that the primary motivation, as stated by this group today, is to generate economic efficiencies in social interventions. So to achieve more with less, and really harness, one would guess, the power of an adaptive delivery model. That's fairly closely followed by an ambition to reduce the time, cost and complexity of creating outcomes-based contracts. And then it looks like building the social investment market and accelerating learning around social interventions are coming up fairly close behind. So Elle, do you want to talk a little bit about the way that we thought about outcomes funds? And then I know we're going to kind of talk a bit about what we found in terms of or potential models we're seeing emerging in the market.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll describe a little bit more of the analysis that we've done, and then we can return to some of these big promises or justifications of the outcomes fund model. So as I was saying, there's 2 parts of the analysis that we've been working on. The first is a prototype open data set. This is available through Indigo. So this is a new publicly available outcomes fund level set of data and definitions. So that describes the headline information on outcomes funds. So something on their scale and their purpose, the geographical extent of outcome payments, and importantly, the connections to the resultant impact bond projects or outcomes contracts. So we see outcomes funds as supporting a particular cluster of outcomes-based projects, and we're beginning to draw the connections between them to show more clearly to the community the relationships between particular outcome funds and their supported projects. So all of the visualizations that Louise has shared so far have been produced using this new open outcome funds data sets. And I can post a link to the data dictionary into the chat, and we're very keen to receive your feedback to improve this and to keep it up to date as more outcome funds emerge over time. And then the second stream of analysis is some preliminary research that we've been doing to try and describe the different administrative approaches that have been pursued by outcome funds in a bit more detail. So on the next slides, I begin to tease out an acknowledgement, I suppose, that paying for outcomes is not as obvious as it sounds. And there are a series of key design choices that need to be made by outcome fund administrators. And these are the different approaches that can be adopted by outcome funds across their relationship, if you like, of supporting different outcome projects. So really this is about how the administrators of an outcomes fund go about signalling what constitutes an acceptable outcomes project into which payment for outcomes can be made. And we can broadly think about this as the rules of the outcomes fund game, if you like. Our framework has been informed by quite a practical approach, and there are sort of 5 overarching questions or spaces of key design thinking, informed by quite sort of journalistic W-type questions. So an outcome fund needs to make a design choice on the what, the policy area and outcome measures. So what policy area to focus on, what outcome measures to use. It also needs to make a call on the who, the cohort or group of people to be supported by the resultant outcome projects. There are questions of how much when it comes to outcome pricing, how much will be paid for the achievement of outcomes. And there are the when type questions for outcomes verification as well. So when and on what basis will we acknowledge that outcomes have been achieved and make payment available? And finally, there are a set of how type questions, or perhaps then this is better put as a with who type questions, because outcome funds can also send signals about the parties that need to be involved in an eligible outcomes project. So they might set expectations around whether an independent investor might be involved, whether an intermediary organisation is expected to be the broker of the outcome projects, or whether an independent evaluator is expected. So if these are then the spaces of different design choices, on the next slide, we see that there are different approaches available to outcome fund administrators on each of these dimensions. So when facing each of these design questions, administrators can opt to be more rules-based. So that is, they can be more specific. They can offer detailed prescriptions in advance for what acceptable outcomes-based projects look like. So they determine the substantive elements of the outcomes-based projects in advance of inviting calls for proposals from potential applicants. Or against each of these dimensions, outcome funds can be more principle-based. So they might offer flexibility and be more open in the directives, and that leaves scope for interpretation and then gives choice and flexibility to applicant outcome projects. So we can walk through this with a few examples then. So in the space of the what, in terms of what outcomes funds might cover in policy area and outcome measures, an example of a rule would mean that in advance of inviting applications, outcome fund administrators tightly define the policy area or the policy challenge and also specify outcome measures. So they might set a prescribed specific outcome metric that needs to be used by the resultant outcome-based projects. And so here on the left-hand side of this chart, we have an illustration of this rules-based approach. So this comes from the Innovation Fund, the first outcome fund that we've seen so far. And this is the menu of highly specific outcome metrics, which were set out in advance of inviting proposals. So very specific qualifications and requirements on the outcome metrics. Under a more principle-based approach, the funds might be completely open on policy area and outcome measure, or they might use some softer, looser signals, perhaps identifying a number of sustainable development goals. So perhaps signalling that health, well-being and inequality or decent work might be an important space for the outcomes projects, but ultimately the applicants are invited to define the outcome measures for themselves, so they're considerably less prescriptive. On the next slide, we see the options around defining the cohort of people or perhaps some other unit or like a geographical catchment area that needs to be supported. So a rule here might equate to a tight ex-ante eligibility criteria for the outcomes projects, and that's defined by the fund administrators. So we see examples where the projects must support young people aged 16 to 25 who have left the care system, who are already out of education, employment and training. So it's quite specific and established in advance. Whereas a principal might give those projects latitude to shape their own eligibility criteria. So the outcomes projects themselves can choose who to support. And similarly, we can see variation in terms of the outcome pricing approach. So in terms of the rules here, some outcome funds might set prices in advance for outcomes. So in a rate card type model, there are maximum prices set for outcomes, or perhaps a preset procedure or formula that can be used to establish an appropriate price for outcome payments. And then the converse of that is a more flexible approach where discretion sits with applicants in terms of how to establish what price to pay for outcomes. You're probably getting into the rhythm of this, but we see a similar model when it comes to the approach for authentication or verification of outcomes achievement. So on the next slide, you can see that as part of the outcomes payment mechanism, a rule-based approach would establish maybe a particular type of evaluation that's very specific, perhaps ex ante, establishing that outcome verification must be established by an RCT, requiring a particular evaluation method for outcomes payment to be made. And we might see more softer sort of principle-based approaches that give flexibility to applicants to develop their own approach to outcomes authentication. And there are also a set of potential rules that we see around who else needs to be involved in the resultant impact bond or outcome projects. So there are a cluster of kind of who else type rules, and we see a considerable variation here in terms of whether an investor might be required, whether an independent evaluator might be required, or on a principle-based arrangement, when considerable discretion is given to outcome projects themselves to decide which parties should be in the mix on the resultant outcome-based project. Okay, so that's broadly the type of variation that we've been trying to describe in the population of outcome funds around the world. And so we've been using a method called qualitative content analysis. Essentially, that's a method that is a process of coding qualitative data through systematic categorization to try and identify patterns. So we've been looking at source material from expressions of interest, from calls for proposals and other outcome fund documents to map and trace the degree to which different funds adopt different approaches against these sort of rule spaces. It's all currently under development, so we're really keen to get feedback on this as a framework. But what I can tell you in terms of our findings so far is that there is considerable variation across our outcome funds. So there are examples of funds that are principle-based across all dimensions. There are some which are rule-based across all dimensions or almost all dimensions. And then we also see funds which offer a real mix, drawing on principle-based approaches on some dimensions and rule-based on others. So there's an enormous amount of variation in terms of how outcome funds administer themselves. And it's at this point that I'll hand back to Mara to set us off with a bit of a provocation in terms of mapping the intent of outcomes funds against some of these potential administrative approaches. So over to you, Mara.
Thank you, Ed. So I think like one of the main contributions of the work that we've been doing is coming up with a definition about what an outcome fund is. And if you've been following the chat, many questions have been asked about what is actually an outcome fund and how is it different from an impact bond and how is it different from payment by results. And indeed, we found there was a lot of confusion out there. There are many things that self-label themselves outcome funds. And in fact, they are very different things. So there are investment funds that are called outcome funds, and there are teams, and the name of the team is outcome fund. But we tighten up a little bit the definition, defining an outcome fund, as we said, with these 4 different categories. So it has to be a pot of money that is dedicated to payment for outcomes. The intention is to issue a number of contracts. Often these contracts are individual impact bonds, but there might be other type of outcome contracts. So there is an openness to involve impact investors. Sometimes that's a rule, sometimes that's more an indication that is welcome, but not necessary. And the one that we looked were up to November 2020. But already coming up with the definition was difficult. But then when we tried to describe why people set up an outcome fund, we came up with a multiple description. And so the work that we've been doing, as Elle was hinting at the end, was to cluster the different shapes of outcome funds based on how strict they were in requiring how things should be done on the what, the who, the how much, and how loose they were. So the emerging model seems to suggest that depending on what is your intention, for instance, I want to promote a lot of social innovation, it seems that the funds that are interested in promoting social innovation are the ones that left more freedom in deciding the various aspects. So there was a principle to work with a particular cohort, a principle to involve an investor, but they were quite loose in exactly how to do it. And that sort of makes sense because the intention was to create social innovation. On the other hand, there are those that are more focused on efficiency. And if we go back to our poll at the beginning, where most people said the main reason to set up an outcome fund is to create economic efficiency. So it seems that being stricter in requiring what cohort, how much to pay for outcomes, and what is the actual process to go through seems more aligned to the intention of creating impact efficiency. There is, I think, one of the things that we encountered was quite challenging was something that we noticed in particular in the UK, and maybe in the panel discussion we have an opportunity to discuss with our UK colleagues, where in outcome funds that have been promoted in the UK, not all of them, but this is something that we only could see in the UK. There is an attempt to be really strict and impose a rule on various dimensions, and at the same time expecting innovation. And one of the questions that we had was, is that possible? So can you be really, really strict and expect innovation? Or should we anticipate that funds that want to create more innovation, there should be more principle-based and so more loose in prescribing exactly what to do. And those who want to promote efficiency, on the other hand, should be much more stricter on what to do so that we minimize the cost. The outcome pricing is done one, the cohort definition has been done one centrally. So it's a provocation. As Elle said, we look at a total of 17 outcome funds, so it's not a massive sample. But looking at the analysis and going around, it seems that these models of being strict or principle-based, like rule-based or principle-based, seems to cluster around different intention. Time will tell if indeed those who claim to be promoting social innovation and remain loose in terms of defining principle do actually succeed better than the one who are rule-based. So we don't have that evidence at the moment, but it's an emerging clustering of models. So the provocation to me is, does it make sense for a discussion with the panel and with the audience to be stricter when we promote efficiency and to be much more like principle-based if we want to promote social innovation? Does it sound reasonable to you? And then a challenge to the UK colleague, are we trying to do two things with the same instrument? And maybe we need to manage expectation that depending on what you want to achieve, you need to follow a different path, and trying to do both things with the same instrument might turn out to be really, really challenging. I'll stop here to allow enough time for a discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Louise Marina, for such a helpful overview. Lots to unpick there in our discussion for sure. And I already see lots of questions and reflections coming into the chat, some of which have already been picked up. But I was wondering if I could come to you, Louise, and perhaps in response to some of the questions around what the differences are amongst, for instance, impact bonds, outcome funds, who pays for them, how are outcomes set. Perhaps you could just give a couple of examples of how these outcome funds work in practice, and maybe that would sort of get to some of these questions in one go.
Yes, I can see there's been a little bit of confusion in the chat about how an outcome fund relates to an impact bond. So I think it might be helpful actually to start by just defining what an impact bond is. So an impact bond is a type of payment by results contract where the upfront financing of service delivery is paid for by an investor. And so that's a very specific type of outcomes contract. Most outcome funds are set up to issue multiple outcomes contracts. Now, within our definition, we've specifically looked at a cluster of outcomes funds that is open to the involvement of impact investment, because what we know is that particularly for non-profit service providers, they often struggle to self-finance the delivery of their services ahead of the delivery of outcomes, which would trigger payments. And so generally speaking, the funds in our cluster are open to the involvement of investor-backed contracts. But what's interesting is that some of them require investors to be involved, so we'll only accept applications that have an investor pre-funding delivery, whereas others, and it tends to be those that are more focused on driving outcomes for a particular population or a particular set of social outcomes, like a set of education outcomes, for instance, for a particular population. Those outcomes funds tend to be a little bit more open about whether or not investors are involved, and so while they're open to it, they don't require it. So if a provider can use grant funding or reserves to pre-finance their services, that's an option for them. The priority from the commissioner point of view for those contracts is to really harness the adaptive delivery and the flexibility of an outcomes-based contract.
Great, thanks so much, Louise. That's super helpful. I also see that Sebastian, you have your hand up. Did you want to potentially unmute and ask your question live?
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, that's great.
Perfect. Thank you very much for your time. Really glad to be here in this insightful session. I work in social interventions that seek to reduce unwanted teenage pregnancy, to reduce the poverty cycle caused by this phenomenon. And I always think, how are these outcomes going to be chosen by the funds? You know, one fund chooses an outcome, another fund chooses another outcome. What's like the tendency there? Where are they getting these outcomes? Like, or in other words, where are they reaching out to find relevant logic models that are already validated, if you know what I mean?
Great, who would like to take that?
Elle, do you want to respond to that? Or?
Go for it.
I'll give it a go. So I think one of the things that we see is a variation in terms of how specific the outcome funds are in the type of outcomes that they will pay for. So perhaps in policy spaces where there's a longer history of experimentation around using outcome metrics and a clearer sense of the theory of change, there might be more prescribed approach in terms of the exact outcome metrics that are used to underpin a given outcomes fund. But on perhaps I don't know, I'm stretching a little bit beyond the evidence here. In policy spaces where there's less of a clear theory of change in terms of how outcomes are achieved, or an appetite for more experimentation, logically, you might be looser on the type of outcome measures that are seen to be appropriate, and there might be greater flexibility given to projects to experiment with different outcome measures themselves. So you might have an outcomes fund that supports a portfolio of outcome projects, which are actually themselves each working to quite different outcome metrics.
Can I make a small addition to this? We totally, I think, share your frustration to an extent, Sebastian, in terms of it seems that there is a reinventing the wheel many times. So if there was a logic model somewhere and there is an outcome metric that has been considered quite robust or useful, are people going back to scratch and reinventing stuff? And in part, I think the ambition of putting information out there with Indigo, but there are other places where information is pushed out on this model. But is to help people reach out and do not reinvent the same model. So we are trying to index the various impact bond and outcome fund based on what is the policy you're interested in. And we are trying to put in the same place as much information as possible. So although we want to facilitate innovation, people can easily identify who has been doing what, where, how can I reach out to them? Is there a telephone number, an email, so that I can reach out and hear about their experience, what they would do differently. So we didn't cover that, like where the logic model came from, but in part, this piece of work aims to put everything in one place to then allow people to compare different logic models or start from one that seemed to have been very, very helpful before.
Oh, thank you. Just a quick follow-up, because another way of seeing or another perspective there would be the funds being open enough so that social innovators can just come up with their outcomes, and it's just assessed in the evaluation process.
Yes, we do see funds that are very flexible in terms of the outcome measures, and either leave it also to projects themselves to establish the type of evaluation to underpin the achievement of outcomes, or are flexible on the nature of outcomes and the measures, but tight on the type of evaluation approach. So they might specify that it needs to be underpinned by an RCT or a quasi-experimental study, but actually the specific outcome metrics within that evaluation are up for discussion and flexible.
Super quick last question. Because when you say RCTs, like for me is a synonym of long and expensive, and so these funds are only centered at robust organizations that have the monetary strength to wait for years to be paid on the outcomes at the end. You know what I mean?
Shall I take this one? I think it's quite unusual for outcomes to be paid right at the end of a contract. Most outcomes-based contracts have what we call some interim outcomes payments, some as often as quarterly, others annually. And so I think generally speaking, when we're thinking about what kind of evaluation, and when commissioners are thinking about what kind of evaluation is the right fit for a particular set of target outcomes, they'll be wanting to think about a whole range of things, including the timelines on which it might be possible to achieve those outcomes, but also things like, you know, what's the likelihood, what's the risk of paying for an outcome that would have been achieved anyway? So if historically outcomes have been very poor in a particular area and consistently poor in a particular area, and if there are no other policy initiatives targeting those outcomes being launched at the time of the fund, then actually it might be quite low risk that you end up as a commissioner paying for something that would have happened anyway. So I think proportionality around that is something that we would always advise.
Thank you very much. Really insightful.
Great, thanks so much, everyone. I'm conscious of time, but I just want to come to Chi-Hung very quickly. Chi-Hung, I know that you've been picking up on some of the questions very helpfully in the chat. I'm just wondering if you wanted to pitch in with some of your own thoughts on this. Anything you wanted to add?
Well, that's just me being nosy, because I'm interested and involved. That's what I always say. But I think the one thing that really strikes me about the conversations in chat is that I think people might be looking for a template for how you do these things. And it reminds me of the conversations we had way back in 2010 in the early years about impact bonds, where everyone is always saying, how do we do an impact bond? What's a model for an impact bond? And by now, we know that there isn't just one model. And I suspect the same is true for outcomes funds. And I would really advise people not to start thinking about, I want to do an impact bond or I want to do an outcomes fund. It's always to start with, what's the problem you're trying to solve? And therefore, what's the right mechanism for solving those problems? The design rules only make sense when they actually help you come up with a solution that really meets your needs. So don't just look at existing models and think that, oh, let's let's replicate that, and that will therefore work. Even things like education, employment, etc., they look so different in different jurisdictions and contexts. Your ecosystems that you're intervening in are very, very different. Your players are very different. Who are your investors? Who are your outcome payers? Could look very different. So look at your ecosystems, do that diagnosis about what are the strengths and weaknesses, and play to the strengths.
Thank you. Super helpful reminder, Chi-Hoon. And we still have lots of questions coming in, but hopefully we'll be able to pick up some of these in the discussion as we go forward. So just to make sure we have enough time for that, I'm going to pass it on to Andrea for the panel discussion.
Yeah, super. Thanks so much, Tanya. And hi, everyone. I'm Andrea, and I'm a Policy and Engagement Manager at the Government Outcomes Lab. It's great to see so many of you on the line, and clearly there's a lot of interest in outcome funds, but there I say also a bit of confusion. And if the first part of our discussion seems perhaps a bit too abstract or researchy, you'll be pleased to know that we've got an absolutely brilliant lineup of speakers with us this afternoon for the panel discussion. Tanya, would you mind just spotlighting all our speakers? As you might have seen from the program, they all come from quite different backgrounds, really literally from across the world. So we've got representatives who have worked in India, the UK, Africa, Latin America. So it's really a huge privilege to have them with us. Welcome all. Before we kick off the discussion, which we're hoping to frame around 3 core themes, so the rationale for outcomes funds, the implications of the rationales in terms of design choices, and lastly, key considerations and your practical tips in terms of practical implementation. I'd like to ask each of the panelists to just very briefly introduce themselves, and if you could also say just a few words about your work in relation to outcome funds or outcomes-based approaches more generally. It just seemed to me from the chat that people would really benefit from sort of like hearing from sort of like, real examples of outcome funds and how they operate in practice. And perhaps if we go to our speakers in alphabetical order. So Abba, if I can get you to introduce yourself first, and then we'll hear from Avnish, Claire, James, and then Milena.
I hate this alphabetical thing. It always puts me first. Good afternoon, everyone, from, again, a sunny London. My journey into impact bonds, actually, and now what are becoming outcomes funds, started from grant. 10 years of grant making took us to that journey. And I think that sort of defines our relationship with this world quite a bit. And I'll try and bring that out as I speak. We were part of the coalition that led the Quality Education India DIB in 2018 in India, and now still running it. So I'll share experiences from the field on that. And I'm also now part of a team that's designing the first skill impact bond for India, which is actually an outcomes fund by your definition. We haven't gotten on top of definitions as yet in India, clearly, and I should start using them more sensibly. But again, a move towards scale, efficient, and many of the definitions that you put in, but we haven't started redefining it, which I suppose is part of the reason the confusion is there in the audience as well. So that's us, and I try and bring experiences to bear from each part of the experience, the design, the implementation, the legals, all of that.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Abba. Avnish, can I come to you next?
Yes, hi. Thanks so much for having us today and for organizing this great session. So my name is Avnish Gangadharas. I'm the managing partner and co-founder of Instiglio. Instiglio is a nonprofit advisory firm that works on the mission of maximizing impact for every dollar spent. So we do that mostly for results-based financing, structuring different types of instruments, and we work exclusively in low and middle income countries. Our offices are in Peru, Colombia, Morocco, and Kenya. And we have sort of like started this work in 2012, which got us a chance to support some of the pioneering work in impact bonds and outcomes funds. So to date, we have supported around 10 impact bonds in international development, including the first development impact bond in India, the first social impact bond in international development as well in Colombia, as well as the very first government held outcomes fund here in Colombia. So I hope to be sharing some of this experience with you today. In addition to our work with impact bonds and outcomes funds, which we consider to be innovation instruments, the largest part of our portfolio is focused on supporting governments in improving large-scale nationwide delivery systems, through which most of the public funding goes today in spaces and sectors like education, health, and job services. And often that's done through simpler results-based financing instruments and performance management strategies, which also obviously inform a little bit the overall approach to government adoption, which is one of the big focus of the organization. So thank you so much for the invitation.
Avnish, you're a real veteran in this space, so we're very grateful to have you on the session. Claire, can I come to you next?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I've been having some internet issues, but my name is Claire DeVries. I'm First Secretary for the Embassy of Canada here in Bogota, in Colombia, working for Global Affairs Canada. Unlike Avnish, I am not an expert in this. I am an accidental tourist, I would call myself, in outcomes funds. I've only been working in them for the last 2 years with the team here in Bogota, designing an outcome fund for education, or the offer as we call it. So it's been in the works for the last 3 years, and we're just finished our design period with our private sector partners and the Ministry of Education. And we're just about to launch an RFP for the organization that will run the fund. The fund essentially is an education fund. It's a private public sector fund that creates a marketplace for affordable education solutions to be scaled up for the most vulnerable. And in this case, our cohort is, it's broad, but it's really around the most vulnerable here, as agreed to by all the partners that were designing the fund. So girls, women, Indigenous populations, migrants and refugees coming in from Venezuela, and our rural populations. Thank you so much.
Welcome to the session, Claire. James, we've heard from Louise a bit earlier that the UK has been very much leading the way with outcome funds, so it's great to have a representative of the UK government on the line. Can I get you to just briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everybody. This is an interesting, exciting conversation. I'm James McGowan. As it says there, I head up the Centre for Social Impact Bonds, although we've just changed our names to be decided what we'll become, but in effect, we'll be looking at public sector funding more broadly, both social value and social impact, but certainly still focusing on social impact bonds. My team obviously split their responsibilities across those two areas, but one of the very specific things we work on is the Life Chances Fund, which has been touched upon already in this conversation. So that keeps us very busy. My journey into this world, well, in fact, I was working in the private sector originally and heard about this charity called Tomorrow's People, which I then ended up working for a few years. It was a charity that did a lot of work in the outcomes-based commissioning space. They've been involved in the UK government's payment by results contracts through things like employability. It was an employment charity. And I ended up working on the DWP Innovation Fund Round 1 on a program called Think Forward, which is now run as a successful charity. So I've been around the block a few times in social impact bonds and outcomes-based commissioning, and really interested to have a conversation today to share a bit more about what we've learned through the Life Chances Fund.
And thanks so much, James. And Milena, finally, can I come to you? And it'd be great if you could say a few words about how the Education Outcome Fund works in practice as well. So I saw lots of questions in the chat that seem to suggest that everyone would appreciate for a sort of a real life example.
Great, thank you. Thank you everyone for the session. So I'm Milena Castelnou. I'm a principal at the Education Outcomes Fund. Maybe to say a few words about my own kind of journey into this. Prior to joining EOF about a year ago, I was actually at Instiglio for a few years. So it's really nice to be reunited with Avnish here. And so I've had the chance to work on different types of results-based financing instruments, a number of impact bonds and other performance-based contracts and others. And now at EOF, really focusing on outcomes funds as a vehicle. EOF, as its name indicates, is really an outcomes fund vehicle. So we are a hosted trust fund at UNICEF. So we have a permanent structure that allows us to pool funding from different donors and governments to commission different outcomes contracts. The first ones that we're the closest to launch are in Ghana and Sierra Leone, and you've seen them mentioned in the list as part of the research. We focus on education, whether it's basic education, early childhood, or skills for employment. And so in each new country, we design outcomes program around the priorities of the government. And I'll be happy to share a lot more about the design process and some of these considerations in the discussion.
Super, thanks so much, Milena. That's really, really helpful. So we've got about half an hour, 35 minutes for our discussion. And just to remind everyone, please keep asking your questions in the chat. I've noticed some of them down already. And in that spirit, actually, James, can I come to you first? I saw a question early on in the chat asking what have been the key drivers for the adoption of outcome funds in the UK. You've mentioned the Life Chances Fund. So could you perhaps just give us a brief overview of what the experience has been in the UK, and kind of perhaps how the thinking around outcome funds has evolved over time, if you think it has evolved?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, there is a long list of things that one could cite as reasons why you would use social impact bonds. I mean, obviously, the GoLab itself has done some looking into evaluations of programs in the United Kingdom and what the feedback anecdotally from many of those programs was in relation to why people chose to use social impact bonds. And you get the themes of innovation, trying to do new things in different ways, collaboration, trying to get different partners to work together in new and interesting ways, and prevention, i.e. trying to think about how to use your policy interventions at a more early stage as a way of intervening in a market or in a kind of social issue to prevent those issues from becoming worse or indeed becoming a problem in the first place. Those were the reasons why people cited across some of the early outcomes funds and social impact bonds in the UK as to why you would use these tools. I think from a government perspective, there has been an acknowledgement that the way that you design these programs is obviously really important to ensure that you can get the most impact for the people that you're working with. And trying to refine that over time has been the art of making sure that the journey of social impact bonds in the UK has been one that is sustainable and has been continued to be picked up as a way of working. And obviously it's an ongoing job, as our colleagues at the GoLab will attest in terms of the evaluation work that's happening on the Life Chances Fund. But I think one of the very clear things that's attractive for UK policymakers in the use of these tools, and I can't speak for everybody in government, but certainly in terms of conversations that I have, this seems to come up time and time again, is that line of sight through to how your spend is being used in a way that appears to be having the most impact and direct impact on specific outcomes for individuals. So there's a lot of government spend that occurs where that doesn't happen, where you pay for outputs, you pay for something to happen, people come back to you and say that they've done the thing that you asked them to do. That doesn't always necessarily confer that you've actually achieved a social outcome for somebody, or that your money has actually made a tangible difference in that person, in individuals' lives. So the outcomes process and the outcomes-based commissioning process was a way of trying to find a way of tying that payment and making sure that government resources and money was being used in a way which was more efficient in the way that social impact is achieved. And so obviously there's far more complicated background to it than that, and there's lots of design issues which we'll get onto in a minute, which make it a challenge to get to that point. But I think the basic premise is a simple one. You're trying to ensure that you're using public resources and money in a way which gives you as much surety as possible that you're actually helping the people that you set out to help in the first place. And that's got to be the compelling reason really for using these tools, and I think it's really at the heart of why the UK government would use them. I mean, just to give you a quick background to this, and going on to the premise of this first part of the conversation, the approach has evolved over time in the UK, whereby we've looked at broader rate cards, where you have that sort of central control over setting the pricing and the metrics, through to and that still happens, by the way. It's not as if that idea has been dropped, but we've also experimented with what's been touched upon in some of the earlier conversations, which is local and national collaborations, where national government has topped up local government spend in this area in order to give local partners much more say and input into what those metrics happen to be and what the pricing happens to be and what outcomes need to be addressed in their particular area. So it plays back to Chi Hung's point earlier, which is, rather than saying to people, you have to use a social impact bond to do this, if you have an idea for which you think a social impact bond would be the right solution, then come to us and bid into this fund. So that was in effect what we've tried to do through funds like the Life Chances Fund. But as I say, rate cards are still there. They're still very much something that comes from central government and still play a part in government thinking today.
Thanks for that, James. And I can see from the chat that your response resonates with others on the call. So if I were to summarize, I guess effectiveness through a focus on outcome funds is a key rationale for this mechanism. But you've mentioned social impact bonds quite a lot. So I wonder if you could sort of maybe spell out then for us the kind of link from SIPs to outcome funds. And Elle posted in the chat a slightly provocative questions around, are outcome funds the production line for impact bonds? Any thoughts? And other panelists, feel free to chip into this point.
So you throw me with that last question because I don't really understand it. So outcomes funds and social impact bonds. In effect, social impact bond is an outcomes fund. It's just that it's financed differently in theory from an outcomes fund. So in an outcomes fund, you may have a range of different providers who enter into it and pre-finance the delivery of services until outcomes are achieved and payments are received. Some outcomes funds in the past have blended upfront payments with outcomes. So certainly some of those employability programs I talked about earlier, that the charity that I used to work with entered into had quite sizable service fees. So you get paid a chunk of grant funding alongside some of the outcomes that you receive further down the line. But the social impact bond focuses more on the outcome side of things, it's fair to say. And therefore the payments are tied to the delivery of actual outcomes. And therefore there's a time lapse in between the setting up and running of services and the delivery of outcomes. And certainly if you want to engage organizations that you think are going to improve your ability to achieve those social outcomes, and notably therefore the VCSE or voluntary and charity sector is in the UK a route to do that. You can't expect many charities, particularly smaller or medium-sized organizations, to be able to finance the delivery of services until those outcomes are achieved. And thus, social investors are involved to help work with third sector organizations, or indeed act as an intermediary for third sector organizations to pre-finance the delivery of services until the outcomes are achieved and the repayments come in.
Great, super. Thanks, James. Milena, I'd like to come to you in a moment for some reflections on this question of scale, which again came up in Louise's presentation. But before I do that, while we're on this point of outcome funds versus impact bonds, maybe Abba and Avnish, can I bring you into the conversation? And Abba, perhaps I'll come to you first for some reflections. How helpful is this distinction? We saw from Elle's presentation some question marks around the Quality Education India initiative. I don't dare call it an impact bond or an outcome fund anymore. What's been your experience, given your work in India and South Asia more generally?
Yeah, I'm going to start by asking the question slightly different, Andrea. Outcomes funds, to me, presume that scale and replicability is a necessity evolution of an impact bond. And I'm going to question that firstly, because an impact bond can do exactly what James said, set a price for an outcome and not an activity, which is a really powerful way for a policymaker or a grant maker to think, yes, I can pay for an outcome or an impact as against paying for what we traditionally do with grant, which is for activity. Just what are you doing? How many schools, how many textbooks? But say actually I've educated a child and now I can price it well. That doesn't, for me, always translate into an outcomes fund. It could translate into good policy making as well, and learning into that policymaker's work of how that outcome can be bought, can be priced better. So the underlying theory of this conversation seems to be an outcome fund has to be the necessary, it's the tree to the plant that is the impact bond. So question mark on that, and whether that is absolutely a necessary evolution, or perhaps one can have two kinds of evolutions, one being outcomes funds to allow that tree to grow and therefore allow lots of plants of impact bonds and other kinds of valuation of outcomes over activities, or the other one, which is that this is a policy making tool to change the way something is funded, and then it just mainstreams into public policy. So just a provocation to that way of thinking about evolution, and over to Avnish, I'm sure he'll add to that as well.
Excellent, thanks, Abba.
Yeah, thanks. So in terms of I think the origins of outcomes funds, at least in the international development space, has really been around the point that probably Milena is going to speak about, the efficiency argument, right? I think there's a lot of folks who have been noting that issuing an impact bond each time with a different set of templates and tools is just an extremely costly exercise. So we've been looking to replicate and mainstream that. So I won't go in more details because I'm sure she's going to speak about that, but I think that's been a little bit the line of reasoning in our space.
Super. Thank you so much, Avnish. While I have you here, so I noticed a couple of questions in the chat around the involvement of private investors, their appetite to get involved in outcome funds, questions around philanthropic resources contributed to outcome funds. You've got decades of experience in this field. Could I maybe just ask you to reflect a little bit on the rationales of different stakeholders to explore the use of outcome funds from different perspectives, so outcome funders, private sector, voluntary organizations, and so on?
The discussion on the rationale of why people are doing this, right? And I think it's important to note that in developing countries, there's a really important distinction in the role of governments, right? So unlike perhaps in the UK, governments don't really contract services out to the private sector at such scale and to NGOs and so on. So you're often struggling to find this budget line item that's actually going to outsource and sustain outsourcing services, especially in spaces like social protection or education. So the idea that outcomes funds can somehow become a sustainable channel of delivery for governments is actually quite inconsistent with the budget realities of these countries. Few exceptions do exist. And also there's some sectors like workforce development where that's not true. So I think there's some variation there, but I think for large part, governments are not actually looking at an outcomes fund to be a source of delivery because simply they don't have the budgets to support that in the long term. So most people sort of are looking at outcomes fund in that space as a mechanism to really accelerate policy innovation and innovations in delivery that their governments could then adopt, right? So I'll speak a little bit more about that later when we get to design choices. But that's, usually the motivation for governments to engage with that is that they're looking to learn, they're looking to understand what are the innovations and that the innovation ecosystem usually made up of impact investors, donors, and philanthropy organizations financing NGOs at small scale. What are all the innovations that could actually be incorporated back into policy, and how can these outcomes funds really become an essential missing part of the innovation architecture of the government? Because usually you have governments on one side policy making at large scale, and on the other side you have the innovation ecosystem working on this ambition of influencing policy, but not really having a clear way to do that. So this outcomes funds could really become a tool where governments specify innovation needs and directs to some extent the work that's being done in an innovation ecosystem to serve those needs. And I think that's a really powerful leverage that could really structure, in some ways, a private-public partnership around innovating an open source approach to innovating public service delivery, which I think is really exciting rational. So from the government perspective, I think that's the most sort of like salient and compelling pitch that we've been able to make in Colombia and Rwanda and Kenya. It's always the same kind of stuff that interests government. And donors obviously, have an interest to supporting the capacity building and the policy evolution in countries, because I think we're at an interesting shift in international development where donors, including the FCDO, Canada as well has gone through it, Australia has gone through it. There's a big shift of priorities of aid funding away from necessarily pure development funding to policy objectives. So I think countries are slowly realizing that they're not going to be able to handle the burden of service delivery over the long term for their developing country partners. So it's really an important point to reflect on how do we leave capacity behind? How do we actually build sort of these pieces of infrastructure like outcomes funds that can become a tool that governments use to evolve their own policies on their own in the future? And I think that's been of interest to donors as well. And of course, for the stakeholders on the implementation side, so the investors and the implementers, it's been really interesting to be able to be offered a clear way to influence policy, which I think they have been missing for a long time and been looking for. So the impact proposition in that is actually quite compelling. So that's been a little bit, the interesting kind of observations on stakeholder interest across the board. I did want to finish on sort of like one thing, which is, I think we do, when we think about outcomes funds, sometimes we do obsess about the participation of investors in a way that I think can be counterproductive to the policy objectives. So I'd really kind of, over time suggest like, let's drive with impact, let's drive with the policy needs, and then see what pre-financing is needed as an output of that exercise as opposed to as an input of the exercise, which usually then really limits the kind of impact that you can achieve. Anyway, so I hope that was useful.
It's very useful. So outcome funds as tools for policy innovations. Claire, from a sort of outcome funder perspective, active in the international development space, how does that resonate with you? Is what Avnish was articulating, does it resonate with your experience? And I guess more generally, what would you say have been the kind of key drivers from your organization's perspective?
For sure, I think it's does certainly resonates with what the experience we've had so far. I think from a donor's perspective, working in international development, I would go back to what Chi raised earlier and some others around context, and that context is so important. Colombia is a country that's a middle-income country. There are a lot of resources here that are concentrated in very few hands. So 1% owns 40% of the wealth. So you have high inequality, and in the rural areas, some of the development outcomes are at least developed countries. So it's lots of resources that are not very well distributed. So the outcome fund is kind of a way to, bring efficiencies, as we've been talking about earlier. I would say the other part of that is that the education sector here in Colombia also is very unique in that private sector foundations have been long involved in doing their own projects kind of unilaterally and just maybe not very well coordinated towards unified objectives. So an outcome fund, as we saw it, provided maybe an opportunity to kind of coordinate all those actors that are super engaged and very willing, but could perhaps be more coordinated. And then I would agree with what Avnisha said in terms of governance. There's solid governance here in Colombia, and they're super committed to the development sector. So they're an absolutely key partner for us in this, have been a partnership that is based on development cooperation assistance here in Colombia, between Canada and Colombia, that goes back 40 years. And then specifically in the education sector, over a decade of our development assistance dollars have been there. So it's really a great foundation to try something new and to support this great ecosystem that exists, but perhaps could be more coordinated and more efficient. So it's a great place for Canada to try new things, to advance our development assistance, and to what Avnisha said too, just think about transitioning from our traditional use of ODA, which is super precious and declining in some cases, and bring in the resources that are available and trying to get something going. And then finally, I would say it's also the team that we have in the embassy in Canada. Shout out to Federico Salcedo and Martin de Groot, who I've been working with throughout this whole design process. The team, long predates myself and my colleagues, but there's a culture of innovation within the embassy team that has allowed this out-of-the-box thinking to really take hold. And innovation here, I would say it's just being willing to take a little bit of risk and to think about how to do development differently. And they've been doing this for a long time. They're just a wonderful team of people that are super engaged and excited about what the possibilities are. So that culture within the team also has been a great foundation. Thanks.
Great, super. Thanks so much, Claire. I'm keen that we move the discussion on from rationales for outcome funds to some of the design choices involved. But before I do that, actually, or maybe bringing the two together, Milena, can I come to you and ask for some reflections from the education outcome funds, perhaps a little bit on the key rationales for the way the fund was designed, and then maybe you can talk us through some of what the fund looks like in practice and kind of what have been some of the key design choices that you've had to make.
Of course, yeah, thank you. I think I want to differentiate when we talk about outcomes fund as a program. So for example, if I take the examples of our own program, the Sierra Leone Education Outcomes Fund program, or talking about outcomes fund from the institutional setup perspective, which is where most of the arguments around efficiency that Avnish was mentioning come up. So maybe I'll talk first about the program side and then around the institutional side. At a program level, I think one of your key elements of the definition when you presented the research was to say that there needed to be several implementers, so several contracts. And I think that really is a key element of the outcomes fund's rationale, because it brings several benefits. So first, in terms of obviously scale, and I'm thinking here of scale in number of beneficiaries that you can reach by involving a number of different partners, each with their own kind of strength and maybe areas of specialization. But also when we're talking about innovation, I think this is really where the innovation can happen when you have different partners, and whether it is innovation in a very broad sense. So when you were talking about maybe principle-based outcomes funds that can leave a lot of room for innovation, but even in the ones that are more rules-based and are more prescriptive, you can still have innovation in service delivery, which helps you stretch the impact of, within the constraints of your program. There's still usually quite a lot of progress to be made around kind of stretching the impact further. And so this is also kind of a very valuable type of innovation, even if it's more on more specific kind of delivery items. So by involving different partners, different implementers, you get a lot of learnings around what works and what doesn't work. And we have seen this as being a really key rationale especially from government partners for engaging in outcomes funds. And as I guess a transition as well with the second point, the involvement of different kind of implementers also allows you to tackle one of the most common criticisms of impact bonds, which is around transaction costs, long and complicated and costly design processes. Usually the marginal cost of contracting an additional provider is quite minimal when you compare it to the cost of setting up the program. So actually by involving in outcomes fund, by having this idea of several implementing partners since the beginning, you can achieve much larger scale with lower transaction costs. So that's at the program level. And I think where the efficiency comes into play even more is when you're thinking about an outcomes fund set up more institutionally. And so that is really the reason for creating EOF, to have like a specific structure as a hosted fund at UNICEF to be able to channel funding and create a number of outcomes funds in different countries. And I think there are two elements to it. The first one is around maybe the technical expertise. So being very focused on education, bringing this expertise, but also learning from program to program, which will allow us to, with very clear learning agendas and evaluation, to improve the design over time and become more faster and have better design processes, learn from all the purpose incentives, all of the challenges, and kind of take this into account. And the second element is maybe something that is a bit less kind of commonly talked about, but I've been spending a lot of time thinking about it recently around a lot of these transaction costs are actually often driven not so much by the technical design, but almost as much by like the legal and procurement consideration and a lot of kind of these more administrative aspects, which can be extremely cumbersome. And so that very often results in really long delays that can discourage champions. You can end up having to work with templates that are really not fit for purpose for what you are trying to do. We're seeing this in our program in Ghana with the World Bank and the government of Ghana, where we're trying to work around templates that are not fit for results-based financing and having to find adjustments to that. And so every time you do this with a new institution, you're trying to reinvent the wheel and recreate something. And I think the idea of creating EOF as an institutional outcomes fund really adds value there, because we've spent a lot of time working with UNICEF legal team to create a specific set of templates, both for procurement processes and contracts, which then can be used and replicated in different contexts. So I think this efficiency argument, both at a program level and once you have the structure set up to go and create more program over time, is a really key differentiators from, especially if you compare it to the individual impact bond model where you're working with a single provider in a specific context on a very specific kind of design area.
Great, thanks so much, Milena. Avnish, I see a question in the chat specifically around sort of like eligibility criteria from the perspective of, I guess, prospective investors or donors in terms of selecting the potential involvement in outcome funds. Perhaps can I come to you for some reflections around that, just from your experience? And perhaps linked to that, maybe then some reflections in terms of kind of getting government buy-in as well. And then James, I'd like to come to you next after we hear from Avnish, just from some reflection. Again, I saw quite a couple of questions in the chat around outcomes definition, how are outcomes decided, identified in the context of an outcome fund. So it'd be great to hear about how that process has worked in the context of the Life Chances Fund and beyond. But over to Avnish first.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. And let me start with that second question on government adoption. And I think this is kind of really important for us in international development context again, because we often start with donors. Donors are putting funds in the outcomes funds, and then we're doing something in the outcomes funds, and then there's that important question: what happens after? So we produced, learning, a solution, and a cost-effective intervention. That question of the exit strategy of that innovation, that scale strategies becomes so critical, right? And I think we've been often talking about, and I think Milena as well mentioned it right now, our theory of change has been, we sort of like, source really innovative ideas and we produce them and we kind of work with governments then to adopt and, scale that up within policy. And I actually think that what we've learned in the last year, especially kind of engaging governments in their COVID response, and that has been a bit of a tangential learning, is that I think we're doing it wrong. Like, I think the design of outcomes funds has been fundamentally not set up for government adoption, and we got to really radically evolve it. And here's why, like, the design of outcomes has been donor-led mostly. And donors very naturally are pushing for very ambitious improvements in deep outcomes, right? They're gonna ask for improvement in literacy, 2 standards deviations improvement in literacy, or show me how your intervention is really improving, poverty outcomes for ultra poor and so on and so forth, right? And intuitively, you'd think that's a great thing. Donors should be asking for deeper and deeper outcomes. But the thing that we've learned is that this is drawing us further from the policy influence ambition and the big impact that we want to have. And why is that so? Let's just think about what happens when you are commissioning for very deep impact indicators. So a couple of implications that are actually quite counterproductive. First, you end up selecting the very best NGOs in the countries, especially because investors want to back them up. So these NGOs have extremely high capabilities usually that are orders of magnitude higher than what our government partners have. So they produce complex, interventions that are very effective, but not at all replicable. Governments will never be able to take that, never be able to replicate it. Second, because they are, mostly international NGOs and they have high capacity, they also are costly. So we end up paying very big unit prices for these results, way out of whack with what governments can afford. So again, that's a huge problem around scalability afterwards. And then because we're asking for very ambitious outcomes, it takes time. It takes 3-4 years in general for impact bonds and outcomes funds to actually produce anything. And that is, completely out of cycle with administrative cycles that are 4-year cycles. So the product we're selling to government ends up being, a solution that is effective, but too complex for replication, too complex for operationally being handled by government systems, too costly to scale, and we end up producing them in a time frame that is completely misaligned to their own cycles. So the product itself is not actually starting with the government and serving the government in the way that they need to. And that perhaps explains, the very slow take-up of governments that we've seen in the last 4 years. We've seen, government commitments less than 7 million, if the records are right, in the last 8 years, in terms of government's own funding going into these instruments, whether it's impact bonds or outcomes funds. So we got to there's many reasons for that, but part of it, I do think, is that we got to redesign. And how do we redesign? I think first we benefit from starting with a different question. Not what sort of the donors in the outcomes funds want, but rather what policy design failure or delivery challenge we want to solve for governments. And they need to drive it. They need to actually define it. And we should try to drive that to a very specific and narrow challenge, that really affects policy results. And that should be a problem that can be solved cheaply, that can be solved in an operationally scalable manner within a time frame that's no more than a year, I would say, given the time frames of governments, right? So let me just give you an example. Instead of contracting out, a fully packaged program that delivers literacy outcomes, we may want to issue a challenge to reduce teacher absenteeism, which is a big problem in most countries, but it's a small delivery challenge that has many known solutions to, but currently are not being applied, right? So we need to, design challenges that are appropriately constrained. We need to design challenges that can be produced very quickly, that can produce within a cost, margin that governments can actually afford, that can produce with capabilities that governments have, that are not out of whack with their own capabilities, and that have a scalability potential, right? So I think we got to really rethink how we're focusing these challenges to actually start with the government's questions and work within their realities, so that we can really play out that potential and that we've been talking about of governments adopting things and scaling them. And that's very promising, right? If we're able to do that, we'd be able to have, in some ways, an open source approach to policy delivery, where different innovators can actually regularly contribute to small bits and pieces that are failing and innovate on them. But that's going to require a really big shift in mindset from donors putting funds in the outcomes funds in terms of what they're looking for. And I think the real indicator of success for this space is how much we've been able to influence policy and generate this delta as an impact at scale, right? And that comes after what happens in the outcomes fund. So I think we got to start with that exit strategy in mind.
Right, starts with the exit strategy in mind. Thanks for that, Avnish. Just really mindful of time. Milena, I'll come to you in a second, because I think you had a specific examples following up from Avnish. We've only got 3 to 5 minutes together. So I did promise we will touch upon practical considerations for implementation. So before we wrap up, I would like to invite each of the panelists to share one practical tip, word of advice based from your experience, anything that we didn't get a chance to touch upon in this session, for those in the audience who might be contemplating either developing an outcome fund or are currently involved in perhaps the early stages of setting up an outcome fund. So one key, very practice-focused top tip for our audience. Milena, I'll come to you next. And James, can I then just check, because I did promise I'll come to you for some reflections around outcome definition, impact measurement in the context of life chances funds. Perhaps you can weave that into your final takeaway or top tip, but Milena, over to you first.
Great, thank you. And I completely agree with what Avnish was saying around governments needing to be really central in all of this, rather than like a second consideration, and about having the exit strategy very clear when you go into it. Just to share a practical example of that, in Sierra Leone, work with the government. So the government is a co-outcome funder in the program, so they have also skin in the game. But the whole program has been designed around their priorities, and one of the key constraints that they had was to say, we want to learn about what works and what doesn't work, and we want to be able to take to scale the most effective interventions, but we have budgetary constraints. And so we have actually defined a maximum cost per child of $35 that has to be respected at the selection process, so that any successful intervention actually stands a chance of being taken to scale by the government at the end of the outcome fund implementation. So I think that's really something to consider. So maybe, I guess, like in terms of kind of key takeaway and recommendation to add to this, so having your exit strategy in mind, and having also really scale really top of mind. I think when you try to sometimes test very small pilot, and you assume that this will translate in the same type of kind of impact, when you take it to scale, there are a lot of question marks and assumptions that you're making. And so starting very, very small with the assumption that then it can easily be taken to scale is, I think, something that's a bit challenging. And I want to be sometimes challenging these kind of, we need to really pilot on a very small scale basis. Think about how you can get to large scale from the very beginning.
Excellent, thanks, Milena. Right, so final top tips, key takeaways, and Mara, and Louise, I'd love to have your top tip as well. James, I'll come to you first, then Abba, Avnish, Claire, and then Mara, Louise, and Elle.
Thanks, Andrea. I actually do need to go very shortly, but look, on the premise that flattery gets you everywhere, I will point you to the GoLabs website and say, about 3/4 of the way down the page of the link I've just sent through the chat, you'll find the triangle tool that our colleagues at the Government Outcomes Lab have designed. And I mean, look, if you're looking at setting up an outcomes fund or just looking at individual social impact bonds or outcomes programs, then use that tool and think really carefully about the contents within it and how to interpret them in the context of what you're trying to design, because it's clear that if you don't get these things right, then it can have really profound impact upon the program that you eventually roll out, and that then has an impact on the evaluation, and then that has an impact upon people's appetite to use the tools in future. And so if we've done anything in the last 10 years, it's well, we've certainly learned a hell of a lot around what works and what doesn't. We haven't learned everything, but we've certainly learned a lot. And I would say that that tool is a really useful reminder for policymakers and for anybody who's thinking about setting up an individual outcomes program or a fund, the base as a lens by which to judge the programs that are coming through your fund, and to decide whether or not there has been some really good thought gone into the design principles that help to define the metrics, the pricing, and the outcomes that you're seeking to achieve. I mean, the key takeaway is obviously consider what your policy objective is, consider what your social issue is that you're trying to achieve, and work backwards from that to design a really good theory of change, which allows you to really kick the tires on whether or not you're linking outcomes to the specific policy objective that you want to achieve, whether you're actually going to get to that policy objective through the outcomes that you've designed into your program. Then obviously your metrics and pricing can follow that. But I think if you get that link between those two things right, and you're never going to get it 100%, but if you're going to get it as close as you can to being right, then that should help you a long way to making sure that you have some form of success in what you're trying to achieve. So those are my kind of tips. As I say, I'm pointing towards the GoLabs website. Hopefully that will leave me in good stead with the guys in Oxford.
Excellent plug to our work, James. Appreciate it. Huge apologies, we're slightly over time. James, if you need to drop off, feel free to do so. And everyone else, if you need to leave the session, huge thanks for joining us. We are recording the session, so if you want to catch up on the last 5-10 minutes of the discussion, you can do so in the recording of the session. Otherwise, if you're happy to stay for another few minutes, brilliant. Mara, I know you need to go as well, so I'll come to you next.
Thank you.
Okay, great.
I think I'm repeating a point that Avnish was doing before, which I feel I'm a broken record. I've been a broken record on impact bonds, and I will be a broken record on outcome funds, that unless we have a clear exit strategy, we don't know what we're doing. And I was thinking, as part of the analysis that we did, if you think about the purpose of setting up an outcome fund or outcome type of payment is to create social innovation, then the exit strategy is when you know how to do things differently, you brought a new way of doing things, you move out and you need to think who will take it up, are the incentive right? If the reason is to create efficiency, so doing the same, spending less, same thing, how do we know we achieve that, and then who should take it up, and have we aligned it in order to take it up? So I said it for impact bonds, I'm saying it for outcome funds. You need to know what happens at the end. In some cases, maybe you want to reissue outcome funds many times. For instance, there were this idea at the beginning of being able to tap into some more patient capital to create some funds for prevention that is outside the political, the planning cycles of government. We haven't seen many of those. I think it's still something that is worth considering, but start from the end, or you will never get there if you don't know where you're going.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Mara. Abba, over to you.
Difficult to add to that sort of thing about be clear on theory of change, make sure your end is in sight. I just say have patience, because if you are trying to be thoughtful about the way you're paying for an outcome and you're thinking about scale, and scale means different things in different contexts. In India, 10 million is not scale. And in many outcomes funds are at 20 million now. So the question of scale itself is a question of that you have to ask yourself. If you're doing it at 20 million or 10 million, what does that mean to the policymaker you're trying to talk to? And how are they going to take it to their ministerial counterpart? And if you're going to take, in my case, 2 years to make it happen, are they going to lose interest in you halfway through? So your champion's ability to understand what you're trying to do while having the patience to stay with you as you do it is a critical part of long-term success. You can't have a great idea and then people lose interest in it, and then it doesn't get you what you want. So think longevity is one top tip. Cultivate your stakeholder in a way that they understand this is a long game they're playing with.
Super. Thanks, Avnish. Very quickly over to you, and then Claire and Milena.
Yeah, in addition to what I mentioned earlier about like the clarity of exit strategy and the theory of change, that's so critically important. It's going to differ across contexts. I think, we got to double down on government engagement. We haven't seen enough. We haven't seen governments, we've heard about governments sort of being at the table, but not really driving the funding, not really driving the doing, right? So the question about how do we get to that moment where governments take up, I think is what this ecosystem could really focus on in the next 5 years, right? How do we build government infrastructure, government procurement systems, government teams, really house those initiatives within government so that we can see those capabilities being built over time and being taken over and being sort of used by our government partners. I think that to many of us in many countries where we work, government is the scale partner. There's no other scale partner to think about, right? When you're talking about NGO solutions. So I think getting them into the game is going to be critically important.
Great, thanks, Avnish. Claire.
Thanks. Yeah, I would agree with what's been said, especially around the exit strategy. It's a great reminder. For us, I think what's worked so far, we're just still right at the very beginning of all this, but we have been able to co-create the outcome fund and design it with our private sector partners and the Ministry of Education the last 6 months. So I think that we've had great commitment and dedication from all our alliance partners. So partnership, I would say, is key. Relationships are key. As with all innovation, it takes longer than you think, and to be flexible try to be flexible in processes and thinking about how to get there. And then as from a donor's perspective, in trying to get things approved, I would say anticipate the misunderstandings around the complexities around outcome funds and the time that it takes to educate key decision makers within your organizations, and to set up advocacy within your organizations early on, so that that will facilitate their decision making around the investment that you want them to take. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Claire and Milena. I've just realized we've already had your top tip. Louise and Elle, can I come to you for maybe any final reflection, takeaways, or dare I say an attempt to summarize the discussion we've had this afternoon? Maybe Louise first and then Elle?
I'm going to let Elle summarize because I think she'll be much more eloquent than me. I guess in terms of my top tip, I would just really, so much of what other panelists have said really resonates in terms of the critical importance to start with the impact intent before you decide anything, before you even decide what you're trying to design, really to think about that, and both within and beyond the time frame of any potential contracts, and that I think is true for any program, but certainly is true for impact bonds, outcomes contracts, outcomes funds. I think the other piece that we have found to be really important in our work is having government at the table. And Avnish, I really like your idea of outcomes funds as a social innovation mechanism for government. I think, and Claire, what you said earlier around how far too often the NGO sector is sort of operating completely in parallel to government's policy objectives, and how these kinds of contracts can be a really interesting tool to bring those into line, to get everyone pushing in the same direction, I think is something that really resonates with what we see. And I guess the only observation I would make, I think, beyond what's been said, is that we do sometimes see outcomes funds specifically as a tool that is used by governments to extend beyond political timeframes. And so where I completely hear what you're saying, Avnish, in terms of, 1 year is long enough, and in a 4-year election cycle, actually, sometimes there just are outcomes that particular governments do want to push towards that are longer term than that, are going to take longer to move the needle on. And outcomes funds as a potential mechanism for governments to ring fence their funding beyond a political cycle for impact that they really care about, I think is potentially an interesting angle that we haven't really discussed today, but we do see in some of our work.
Super, thanks, Louise. Oh, you'll get the final word on the session, but before we come on to you, I just want to say huge thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon. Apologies, we've gone slightly over time, but it's been such a rich discussion that I really didn't want to interrupt any of the speakers. In many ways, it feels like we've just scratched the surface in terms of this discussion. So we really look forward to continuing some of these conversations online. If you've got any questions that we didn't get a chance to cover in the session, drop us a line and we'll do our best to answer your questions. And huge thanks to our panelists for such insightful contribution to discussions. Really appreciate having you on the session. And with that, Elle, final words, and after that, we'll say goodbye to everyone.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for such a dynamic conversation, a tough one to synthesize, but I think what we're beginning to hear is that outcomes funds are an incredibly flexible tool to promote the adoption of outcomes contracting, and that they might enable a range of stakeholders to work together and work together quite differently to focus on outcomes. But I think I'll really echo some of the key recommendations coming from the panel. I think we need to really get frank about what the different versions of the tool might be about. There are an enormous number of different policy ambitions that are getting loaded onto outcome funds. Is it about scaling the market? Is it about learning what works? And so I think we really need to have candid conversations in terms of the purpose of different outcome funds. So that might mean that we're experimenting with the outcomes contracting approach itself, thinking about different outcome measures, different ways of structuring and bringing partners together. Or it might be a tool to experiment with services. So that might involve running multiple outcomes projects with the very same outcomes metrics and learning about what works by reading across those. So are we experimenting with outcomes contracting, or are we experimenting with a service? Are there other policy ambitions that really are the priority for a different outcomes fund? And really, I suppose it's to say that no single outcome fund tool can ever deliver across all of these promises simultaneously. So we really need to think about whether it's reduced transaction costs or greater flexibility. What is it that we're striving for? And think about that as we develop the approach more broadly. Back to you, Andrea.
It was an incredible summary. Oh, thank you so much, and very thoughtful as ever. Right, all that's left for me to say is again a huge thank you for everyone, for such an incredible session, and I hope to see you on our next webinar in May. Thank you, and bye from me.